Arthur Duperrault had long dreamed of taking his family sailing on the azure seas of the tropics. Looking out on the chilly blue waters of Lake Michigan, the optometrist from Green Bay, Wisconsin, recalled the warmer waters to the far south that he had sailed during World War II. He spoke often of wanting to live for a year on a sailboat, cruising around the world from island to island. By 1961, Duperrault had become successful enough to fulfill that dream, at least in part. That year, instead of facing a hard Wisconsin winter, he, along with his wife Jean, his 14-year-old son Brian, and daughters, 11-year-old Terry Jo and 7-year-old Renee, headed off to the Bahamas. They planned to spend a week trying out life at sea on a chartered yacht, and to extend the sabbatical if all went well. They arrived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they had found the perfect boat to rent, a 60-foot, two-mast craft called the Bluebell. The Bluebell seemed to be a perfect home for his family for the next few months, so Arthur closed the deal and began looking for a captain to pilot her. He soon came upon the perfect candidate, decorated pilot Julian Harvey, who had served and won medals in World War II and Korea. Also along for the ride was Harvey's new wife, Mary Dean. On the morning of Wednesday, November 8, 1961, the Duperraults went aboard the Bluebell to begin their eagerly awaited voyage and set sail on what they would describe as the trip of a lifetime. Over the next few days, the Bluebell sailed along the island chain of Bimini, stopping at tiny villages and taking in the sun and the water. That Sunday night, the boat pulled to a stop near a place called Sandy Point, where the family enjoyed a meal of chicken cacciatore and turned in early, planning a return to the States the very next day. For 11-year-old Terry Jo, this would be a night that changed her life forever. Around 9 p.m, Terry Jo headed below deck to her sleeping quarters in a small cabin at the back of the boat. She drifted off early, rocked by the motion of the waves against the ship. But after a few hours, she was jolted awake by the sound of her brother Brian. Brian was screaming for help from his father. "Help! Daddy, help!" She also heard brief running and stamping noises. Then silence. She lay in her bed shivering, disoriented, and terrified. After around 5 minutes, Terry Jo crept out of her cabin. It was here that she would encounter a scene that would chill her to the bone. Her mother and brother lying crumpled in a pool of blood in the main cabin, which functioned as a kitchen and dining room during the day, and was converted into a bedroom at night. Both had been slashed repeatedly with a knife, and Terry Jo could tell that they were dead. Slowly, Terry Jo climbed the stairs and stuck her head out of the hatch. She saw more blood pooled on the side of the cockpit, and possibly a knife. She climbed onto deck and turned towards the front of the boat. There, in the darkness, stood a silhouette, Captain Harvey. Suddenly, Harvey lunged at her, his face contorted in fury. "Get back there," he growled, shoving her down the stairs. Stupefied with terror, she retreated to her bunk. She could hear water sloshing around on the deck, and thought the captain might be washing off the blood. Soon after, she smelled oily water that had begun to seep into her cabin. Suddenly, the captain's dark form silhouetted in the cabin's doorway. He had something in his hands, possibly her brother's rifle, and stood looking down at her. He said nothing, when suddenly he turned and climbed the stairs. Soon after he left, Terry Jo once again left her cabin as the water steadily rose. Wading through waist-deep water to the stairs, she climbed to the top deck. She spotted Harvey and asked him if the ship was sinking. "Yes," he shouted. Captain Harvey handed Terry Jo the line attached to the dinghy to hold, but she let it slip through her hands and it went into the water. Harvey immediately jumped overboard to go after the dinghy, and after this, he disappeared into the night, leaving Terry Jo all alone on the vessel to drown. Thinking quickly, Terry Jo was able to untie a small cork float from the wall and rowed it off the ship. As the boat disappeared beneath the water and the sun rose slowly over the horizon, Terry Jo found herself completely alone, surrounded by hundreds of miles of open ocean. She huddled low on the float, afraid that the captain might be lying in wait for her in the dark waters. She had no water, no food, and in her thin white blouse and pink pants, nothing to protect her from the chill of the night. The moon had set and heavy clouds denied her even the light of the stars. She could hear the moan of the wind, but see nothing. Waves broke without warning, the salt water stinging her eyes and lips. A sudden shower drenched over her, and she began to shiver uncontrollably. As her feet dangled in the water, parrotfish began to nibble at the vulnerable skin on her legs. Terry Jo could feel the moisture leaving her body with each passing hour, and she began to hallucinate. She saw her family and heard their beckoning voices. Dark shapes began to appear in the water. At first she feared that they might be sharks, but as they broke the surface, she could see that they were porpoises, guarding the young girl as she drifted across the waves. She would need their help to weather the trying days to come. Over the next few days, Terry Jo endured the blazing sun and the freezing winds at night. She had nothing to eat or drink for almost 4 days, and she began drifting in and out of consciousness. She was living in a dream world where the line between her visions of being with her family became blurred with the harsh reality of her ordeal at sea. On the Tuesday, a small red plane circled overhead. She watched it and waved at it for a long time with her blouse. At one point it dove in her direction. She waved frantically, her heart pounding with hope. The plane passed directly overhead, close enough that she could see the details of its underside, but at an angle that made it impossible for the pilots to see her. The average person can only survive around 3 days without water, so by the time that the sun rose on the 4th morning and Terry Jo's eyes fluttered awake, she was on the verge of death as her kidneys began to shut down. Wednesday dawned bright and clear, and it grew hot very quickly. The glare of the sun caused her dry eyes severe pain. Her muscles ached, her skin burned through her blouse and pants, her lips were rough and swollen. For most of the time, Terry Jo had to balance rigidly on the edges of the unsteady float because much of its rope webbing had broken away. She hallucinated even more now. But on that morning, as her eyes opened, she saw an enormous ship coming out of the haze on the horizon. In her extreme state, she thought it was a huge whale swimming towards her, but as it got closer and she could hear the hum of its engine, she realised that she had been saved. It was a Greek merchant vessel, plying the trade lanes in the Caribbean, and there, at the end of her strength, it had happened upon the young girl adrift at sea. Terry Jo's story quickly made the papers, and the photo of a ghostly little girl on a raft quickly spread across the nation. When Julian Harvey had been hired as the skipper of the Bluebell, not a lot was known about his earlier life. The 44-year-old was a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, married to Mary Dean Jordan, an aspiring writer, and a former TWA flight attendant. The day after the Bluebell went down, the lookout on a Puerto Rico-bound oil tanker spotted a small wooden dinghy floating in the middle of the broad and deep Northwest Providence Channel. When the captain pulled the tanker closer, a man in a dinghy yelled, "My name is Julian Harvey. I am the master of the Bluebell." In the days that followed, Harvey told the Coast Guard in Miami that he was the sole survivor of a grave incident. In the middle of the previous night, he reported, a sudden squall had damaged the sailboat. Harvey claimed that he had tried to save the passengers, but the ship had gone down too fast, and everyone on board had drowned. His wife Dean and the Duperraults were injured when the masts and rigging collapsed. Gas lines in the engine room ruptured, and the ship caught fire as it slowly sank. Harvey said that he managed to launch the dinghy and raft and dive overboard, but tangled rigging trapped everyone else on board the ship. The authorities accepted Harvey's explanation and let him go free. A few days later, installed at the Sandman Hotel, Harvey had heard that Terry Jo had survived. The next day, a maid at the hotel saw blood on the sheets in Harvey's room. When she couldn't open the bathroom door, her manager had called the police. They forced the door open and found Harvey's bloodied, lifeless body on the floor. A suicide after having slashed his wrists with a razor blade. After being pulled from the ocean by an officer of the Greek freighter, Captain Theo, Terry Jo was taken by helicopter to a Miami hospital. A week after her rescue, officials questioned Terry Jo in her hospital bed. Terry Jo's account of the accident conflicted with Harvey's, and taken with his suicide, the police began to look into Harvey's past. It was here that they discovered that Harvey had been married 6 times, and his last wife had died in a mysterious car accident, which he had managed to survive. Police noted that Harvey's wife had a $20,000 insurance policy. Thanks to Terry Jo's account, they concluded that he murdered his wife for the insurance money and killed the rest of the passengers to keep his crime secret. Terry Jo returned to Green Bay to live with her father's sister and her 3 cousins. When she was 12, she changed her name to Ter. Ter has lived a mostly quiet life since then, trying to move past her ordeal, but she eventually penned an account of her experience in a book called Alone, Orphaned on the Sea, allowing her story of heroic survival to serve as an inspiration to people all over the world. If one person heals from a life tragedy after reading my story, my journey will have been worth it.